All right, hello everybody out there in heavy metal land. My name is Alan, and it's time. Let's talk some metal. Tonight, we're going to talk a little new wave of British heavy metal. Um, Often with new wave of British heavy metal, the conversation veers into singles because so many bands got to release 7-inch vinyl but never got to that full album stage. So I thought tonight I would look at a few full-length albums, some that are a little better known and some that aren't. Going to go over three personal favorites from over the years. Again, this will give you a chance to maybe hear about some new bands, and we'll give them a talk, we'll give them a listen, and see what we think. I'm going to start with a band that, again, most folks are going to know this name, but a lot of folks may not have ever gotten a chance to hear them very much. And the band we're going to talk about is Holocaust. Yes, Metallica covered Holocaust. That's how everybody's heard of Holocaust. So everybody knows the name because of the Metallica covers, but not a lot of folks have ever gone back and checked out the original band. This is their debut album. Came out in 1981. It's called The Nightcomers. And yeah, it's one of the sort of classic heavy metal LPs from the era, but it's one that doesn't always get mentioned. Sometimes it kind of gets bypassed in favor of some of the other big albums from the time. And part of the problem is Holocaust has kind of a weird legacy within the new wave of British heavy metal. The band started out in the earliest 80s, kind of right in the prime new wave of British heavy metal era. Put out a couple of EPs, had some strong songs on them. They got a good amount of attention. They got the Nightcomers album out, and again, cool logo, cool cover art, and has a really strong track list for the most part. Let's check out what all's on this one. Well, if I can read the little tiny print, you've got songs like Smoking Valves, Death or Glory. You've got Don't Matter to Me, Crying Shame, Heavy Metal Mania, Nightcomers. A lot of good stuff on here. There are a few songs that miss the mark a little bit. But one thing that Holocaust had going for them on this record is they were a bit heavier than a lot of their contemporaries at the time. New wave of British heavy metal bands overall sometimes get a stigma of being not quite heavy enough for some people's tastes. Holocaust at this stage were doing something, kind of in the Angel Witch level of heaviness. Let's give a listen. Let the band do the talking for themselves. This is the track Death or Glory. All right, there's a sample from Holocaust. And as you can see, pretty heavy stuff. You can see why that one would have appealed to a young Lars Ulrich and company, and why they would choose it to come back and give the band a cover version later on. Here's a different pressing of it. This one's on the Lark label, which I think is the Danish pressing. So same album, but different color scheme, where it's got sort of the pinkish red highlights on the cover. So just slight variant. You don't see this one around as much, but something I came across once upon a time. So yeah, Holocaust seemed to be off to a really good start in the new wave of British heavy metal. Something that started to trip them up. The heavy songs, like the one you just heard, are very good, strong, heavy numbers. But interspersed with those, they had some songs that were very sort of plain rock songs. So not every song had that really heavy riffage to it. Some of them just felt more like kind of typical bland 4/4 time, hard rock songs, and not even all that hard, almost just plain rock songs. So that was a little bit of an issue. Another thing that tripped up the band was it took them a long time to get the second album out. Album number 2, No Man's Land, didn't come out until 1984. And that album just doesn't have much going for it. It sounds like a band with no new ideas, who are almost bored. And instead of embracing that heavier side of their sound, they were just kind of going through the motions on that more, straightforward and plain rock side of their sound. That album was not well received. I don't know if I've ever heard anybody say much good about No Man's Land. I owned the album once upon a time, and I did not keep it very long. It just does not have any of that power or bite that the Nightcomers have. Now, Holocaust would go on to have a long career. They've released new albums even just within the past 2 or 3 years. Later on, their albums got very different in style. I've heard very little of that later material, but I know some of the albums they've been compared to having like a lot of Voivod influence and getting sort of a heavy but weird style mixed in on later stuff. So that later material has a good following. It's a band that has a cult status and always has. But yeah, that very early material, the Nightcomers and those early EPs, that's the really good prime new wave of British heavy metal stuff from their catalog. All right, let's move on to a band that's not as well known, but it's an album that I've always loved. It is the self-titled album from Desolation Angels. So now, right away, this album has several cool things going for it. Cool band name, Desolation Angels. Yes, it's technically from a Bad Company song, which makes it somewhat less cool. Pretend you don't know that and just focus on Desolation Angels, and it sounds awesome. Wicked cover art with Grim Reaper riding a kind of dragon-winged horse through the middle of a cemetery, crushing everything as it goes. Yeah, you see this in a used, record store, you're buying it. You're picking that up to see what it sounds like. This is one I got back in the mid-90s from a vinyl dealer who had written it up with a very grandiose, hyped kind of description. And this one really deserved the hype, in my opinion. This is the British press on Fame's side. The album got reissued at some point in Brazil on, I think it's the Rock Brigade label. So, deal with Desolation Angels. They had started out right in sort of the height of the new wave of British heavy metal, released some demos around 81, 82. They had a 7-inch single in 84. They didn't get this full length out until 1986. And 1986 is really pushing it to still call something new wave of British heavy metal. That's about the last year most folks are going to give any new wave of British heavy metal points for. What does the album sound like? It's pretty easy to describe. It's essentially early 70s Black Sabbath powered up a little bit. Let's just go to the tape and let you hear it for yourself. I'll jump about a minute into the opening song, Spirit of the Deep. Yeah, let's jump forward because this one just kind of slowly builds up with a little intro. All right, that gives you a good sample of Desolation Angels. Yeah, it's got a very doomy sound to it. It has always struck me as something like sort of early Ozzy era Black Sabbath, just powered up for the 1980s versus the early 70s. Cool side note about this album, my parents actually got this for me as a Christmas present because it was something I had seen on those mail order lists. Wanted to get it really bad, couldn't really afford it at the time, and so I'd gotten one of those lists like around Thanksgiving time, and folks were like, "What do you want for Christmas?" And I jokingly, I think I says like, "I want this record in this catalog," and they're like, "Okay, order it, we'll pay for it." I was like, "Wait, what? Okay, you can't take that back. You already promised." Like, no, that's cool. So, thanks, Mom and Dad. Still have it after all these years. Um, so yeah, the whole album is very good. Has that very strong, powerful, but dark and doomy sound to it, just like the cover would indicate. You saw even the picture on the back of the album is really badass. The whole packaging is just great on this. The songs, each one stands out really good. Some of them are a little faster, some a little slower, but each song is well done, unique, distinct from the other tracks. So good listen from start to finish on this one. Now, Desolation Angels stuck around for a while, but the story got kind of strange. At some point after releasing this album in '86, the band relocated to Los Angeles, and they ended up recording more material here and there. They had some demos. They had another full-length album. I think it's called like Flame Still Burns. That was, I think, a cassette-only release. I've only seen cassette copies of it from back in the day. They had a different vocalist at one point, but there's also a version of a lot of that material with the original vocalist, Dave Wall, on the material. So the lineups got convoluted, and more to the point, their sound changed. By the time they were releasing material in LA, they had lost that really doomy vibe that you just heard on the self titled. And as such, a lot of the material felt very flat to me. I've actually had a couple of those old cassette releases back in the day. And yeah, eventually there was a time when folks would pay a lot for that stuff. And I needed money. And I decided, I don't really dig these much. So I let it go. The album's been reissued, so you can pick it up with that original cover. There's also been some anthologies and box sets put out. You have to look at the contents of those pretty carefully. I know they had one box set collection thing put out a few years ago that at first looked really interesting. It's like, ooh, I'm going to have to drop some money on this. But when I started looking through it, again, it was more focused on a lot of the Los Angeles era demos and stuff. I'm just like, really? You're not going to put the early stuff from their, UK days in there? Yeah, I don't think I need to spend money on that after all. So pay attention to what you're getting with Desolation Angels. There are some folks who like that later material, and if so, that's cool. But to me, it's not very interesting sounding. It doesn't have that same power of the self-titled at all. Okay, one last one we'll talk about tonight is a pretty obscure band that is. Now, you're going to look at this and say, the name of the band is Widow. No, the name of the album is Widow. The name of the band is Ritual. Keep looking for it. Can't find it? It's because their name isn't on the cover anywhere. Ritual is a strange band, and it has kind of a strange history to it. I may actually do a full video on Ritual at some point because I really like their music and I find them pretty interesting. Before I give sort of the TLDR version about the band, let's check out one of their songs. They're a new wave of British heavy metal band. This album came out in '83. They have kind of a different sound and style. Now, this is not going to be super doomy like Desolation Angels or super heavy riffage like Holocaust. It's got a much quieter sound to it, very guitar driven, but in a sort of a laid back way, but still in a cool atmospheric way. Enough talking. Let's see what this sounds like. Again, I'll probably skip about a minute into this. This is a song called Burning. Let's skip. Yeah, we'll start about right there. All right, so that's a little sample of Burning by Ritual. So again, as you can hear, it's a band, they have kind of a minimalist sound. There's not a lot of flashy pyrotechnics going on in the music or anything. Song structures are pretty simple, but they create this very, very cool atmosphere. The band is sort of the brainchild of a guy named Gypsy Rebeth, um, kind of a unknown guitar virtuoso a bit. He's has a following here and there. He's known for making some pretty cool, interesting looking custom guitars. Um, the album was a total unknown, even in new wave of British heavy metal circles for a long time. In fact, when the New Wave of British Heavy Metal Encyclopedia was published back around the year 2000 by Malcolm Macmillan, it's a reference I've brought up a few times, the band is actually listed under the name Widow. Malk had found very, very little information about the band, and this was a guy writing an 800-page book that included just about every band under the sun that was active at the time, and even he had issues to the point that he couldn't even get the name of the band correct. So yeah, really unknown for a very long time in collector circles. It finally started getting some attention here and there along the way. The album has been reissued later on. This was done with High Roller Records and Shadow Kingdom Records. So cool artwork. They did this around 2008, 2009, I believe. So it's a lot easier to hear and find now. Now, High Roller has done a more recent reissue that has the original cover art, if you prefer that version of it. There's, again, a lot of sort of unanswered questions about the band. There's a lot of liner notes that came with that first reissue I just showed, but a lot of the information doesn't really jive. And when you read, it conflicts with other accounts from the band and other information online. You get the sense that someone's definitely wanting to keep people guessing a little bit about the band and their history, so that a lot of the information doesn't hold up to scrutiny very well. For example, there's reference to the band releasing some singles back in the 70s, which nobody's ever seen a copy of, and they've never really turned up anywhere. It's a little reminiscent of the scenario with Death SS when they did their cursed singles set in the mid 90s, and they were claiming these are reissues of our original 7 inches that were only available back at our shows in the 70s, except they weren't, because you never released any singles back in the 70s. They were newer recordings. Yes, there's weirdness with that. The album itself, again, is a little weird. Lots of references cite this as having a pressing of 2,000 copies, which, if so, a lot of those copies must have went straight to the dumpster, because it's a very hard album to come across. This is one I got dumb lucky and was able to pick up years and years ago. I would never be able to track this down or afford it these days. So yeah, 2,000 copies sounds suspiciously high for the print run on the album, given how very few copies have shown up over time. Another thing that's always been cited is that there was a printing error on the cover, that the first 1,500 copies left the band's name off by mistake, that it's supposed to say Ritual up here in one of the corners, and they didn't catch it for a while, and so it was only like the last 500 copies that actually have the Ritual name on the cover, which is why it's kind of strange that the band's name isn't on here, and why so many people mistakenly thought the name of the band was Widow. The issue with that story is I've never seen an original copy that has the logo on it. Again, it's a very rare record. It's possible I've just never seen one, but you look through PopPsych, none there. You look through Discogs, none there. I've gone back through my collection of photos of various old auctions and old sale items and stuff, and the few copies that have turned up have all been without the logo on the cover. Now, if you just enter it into Google, you'll start seeing pictures of the album that have Ritual in it, but when you look more closely, it's the recent reissues. It's not old original copies on the Legend label. So I don't quite know what to make of all of it. Maybe there are some copies out there with the name in a corner. And maybe that's just kind of another thing that was put out there to sort of, add to the chase and the hype that there's, more ritual recordings, for folks to try to track down. I don't know the deal. What I do know is the music on it's really good. It's a pretty short album. I think it only runs a little over a half an hour, about 7 tracks. And there's a couple of instrumentals. Again, this is one that is almost more of an atmospheric piece than a really, strong arm of the law, burner, bomber type heavy metal album. But I still find it really, really cool. I think Gypsy Rebeth's guitar playing adds a lot of atmosphere, a lot of layers to it, even though it's kind of a quiet playing and in a way simple playing, it still works really, really well. It creates a very cool vibe on a lot of the tracks. So it's a very neat album. And the band did record some more material legitimately. They have a second full album that came out closer to 1990 called Valley of the Kings, which is also excellent. They did release at least one 7-inch single around that same time that has 2 great songs on it. So even though their catalog isn't as deep as it appears sometimes, they did a lot of quality stuff. And again, just a final note to point out about some of the confusion. If you look on their Metal Archives page, you'll see reference to like a single from 1981 with a picture. Except it doesn't really look like the cover of something that would have been released in 1981. And no copies of it have ever turned up to my knowledge. And there's no listing for anything like that on Discogs either. So again, what's the deal? Not sure. Gypsy Rebeth did release some promotional CDs sometime in the 90s that are more just him playing, and even those, it's really beautiful music. I like it a lot. I've only been able to track down one of them. I know there's at least a second one. But yeah, it's a hard discography to figure out just because there seems to be some misinformation out there in the wild about it. But anyway, that's enough about Ritual for tonight at least. Maybe we'll dive a little deeper another time. But it's time to talk metal in the comments down below. So what do you think of these 3? What's your favorite releases from Holocaust? Do you have any more information about Ritual where you've been able to track down some of these alleged releases that have never really come to light on the collector's market? If so, I'd love to see some pictures or hear about what you've been able to find. With that, let's call it to a close. Everybody stay safe, have fun out there, and remember, keep banging your head.